the CIA's secret mission to recover a nuclear submarine, Project Azorian. The ship shudders. Deep below, 3 miles down, metal groans like something alive. A voice on the radio tightens. Loads uneven, hold. Then the frame jerks, a scream of tearing steel races up the pipe string, and half a Soviet submarine rips free into black water. Silence. No one breathes. They've just lost the prize the CIA built an entire ship to steal. To understand how the United States ended up trying to lift a nuclear-armed enemy submarine from 16,000 feet down, under the world's nose, we have to go back to when it vanished, and why that disappearance ignited one of the boldest covert operations of the Cold War. The vanishing, K-129 goes silent. It began as routine. K-129, hull number 722, a Soviet Gulf II ballistic missile submarine, slipped away from port on 24 February 1968. Her job was simple on paper and terrifying in practice. Hide in the vast North Pacific, then wait for orders she hoped would never come. On board were 3 SS and 4 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, several nuclear torpedoes, and 98 men responsible for keeping a sliver of the Kremlin's deterrent alive at sea. On 8 March 1968, after a test dive, the sub failed to report. In the Pacific Fleet headquarters, routine turned to worry. The return date was months away, but silence from a boat that recently checked in meant one thing: something had gone wrong fast. Soviet ships fanned out in widening circles, hunting for oil slicks, debris, any echo of a hull. They searched the wrong ocean box because their last fix pointed them there. Families waited for letters that wouldn't come. A wife folded the same shirt twice that night. A father set a spare plate anyway. Absence is a sound of its own. Meanwhile, something else was happening far from Vladivostok. In quiet rooms in the United States, ears on the ocean started talking. SOSUS, the Navy's undersea hydrophone network, had recorded an acoustic event in the North Pacific. Analysts at AFTAC, the Air Force Technical Applications Center, built to listen for nuclear tests, pulled the signal apart. The location they triangulated wasn't anywhere near the Soviet searchline. Coordinates in the high 38s north and near 179 west, around 38 degrees 5 N, 178 degrees 57 W, pointed to a deep, lonely patch of seafloor roughly 800 miles northwest of Hawaii. Stakes crystallized fast. If the wreck was there, lying in nearly 16,000 feet of water, it held more than men and steel. It held Soviet nuclear weapons, metallurgical secrets, missile interface hardware, sonar signatures, and maybe code materials. To Moscow, a missing link in nuclear command and control. To Washington, a once-in-history chance to look inside the other side's most guarded systems. To the families, an ache that didn't care about geopolitics. This wasn't a grab-and-go. First, they needed proof. In August 1968, after months of analysis and interagency arm-twisting, the US sent a specialist, USS Halibut, a former missile sub converted into a deep reconnaissance platform. She carried cameras on long wires, strobing lights, grapnels, and patience. Halibut crept over the coordinates and started a grim kind of survey. Pass after pass, the team stitched together frames that looked like smudged moonscapes. Then shapes hardened. A torn pressure hull, the angular geometry of a Gulf II sail, debris fields stretching like a comet's tail. K-129 had been found. What nobody knew at the time was exactly why she died. Theories later multiplied. Collision with another sub, a missile mishap, battery fire. The leading technical assessment would point to catastrophic flooding through the snorkel intake during diesel operations. Water surging in, engines choking, electrical shorts, toxic gases, lights failing, then the weight and the ocean doing the rest. At depth, hulls don't forgive. A descent turns fatal in minutes, sometimes seconds. Whatever the cause, the destruction was rapid and final for the compartments that flooded first. Finding her changed everything. Knowing wasn't enough. If they could get a piece, any piece, Washington could learn how the Soviets built their boats, protected their warheads, and ran their patrols. But the depth made salvage a fantasy. No off-the-shelf tool could reach 3 miles down, latch onto a fractured submarine, and lift thousands of tons through swell and wind. And if the Soviets caught wind of an American recovery attempt, they'd park on the site and never leave. So a new kind of operation took shape, one that would live outside normal lanes. The CIA would lead it, not the Navy. The plan needed a cover that could explain a large, strange ship moving slowly in straight lines in the middle of the ocean. It needed a way to hide whatever it brought up from prying eyes and Soviet optics. It needed technology that didn't exist yet, built at industrial scale, then used once without breaking. While that was happening in Moscow, the absence hardened into ritual. K-129's crew were officially gone, memorials without bodies, plaques without grave. In Washington, the discovery became a secret that only made sense if it could be turned into advantage. The ocean had taken a Soviet submarine. The Americans decided to try to take it back. Here's where the story shifts from loss to ambition. To touch a wreck at 16,000 feet, you'd need a ship the size of a small city, balanced on the sea like a coin, capable of lowering a mechanical hand 3 miles down and closing it around a broken hull. You'd need to bring that hand, and whatever it carried, up through the center of the vessel into a hidden dry dock, so nobody watching from a mile away would see a submarine rise from the water. That ship didn't exist. So they set out to build it, and to tell the world it was for something else entirely. Finding the grave, the hunt with sound and shadows. They had a set of numbers, and a sound like a thunderclap heard through stone. That's where the hunt began. In a windowless room, AFTAC analysts replayed the acoustic spike and stripped it of ocean noise. Whale calls, merchant screws, distant storms, to isolate one violent signature. Cross bearings from SOSUS arrays pointed to a patch of water nobody in Moscow was searching. Near 38 degrees 5N, 178 degrees 57W, drifting toward an even tighter box around 40 degrees 06N, 179 degrees 54E. Deep water. No friendly ports. No witnesses. To confirm it, they needed eyes, not ears. The Navy sent a chameleon, USS Halibut, once a missile boat, now remade into a camera platform with a miles-long tether, strobing lights, and grapnels built to bite metal. On the chart table, the search grid looked clinical, rectangles to be flown like mowing a lawn. On the scope, it was something else. A grey snowfall of silt, a horizonless dark, the camera drifting like a slow balloon over a planet that ate light. Stakes were simple and brutal. If Halibut could prove the wreck was there, the United States gained the option to try the impossible. If she failed, the window closed and the ocean kept its secret. Meanwhile, on Soviet decks much farther west, crews scanned the surface for all sheens that would never reach them, convinced the sub had died closer to home. The Americans had to work quietly, because even a hint of Halibut's purpose would bring uninvited company. Pass 1, nothing but ripples and the occasional rock that looked like a hull until the strobe hit it straight. Pass 2, a scatter of metallic glints that could have been anything. The crew learned the rhythm, fly straight, hold altitude, let the winch pay out and take in as the swell rose and fell. The tether creaked. Strobes popped. Film canisters filled and were hauled in like messages. They developed the reels in a cramped darkroom. The first hours were brutal, smudges, flares, silt ghosts. Then a pattern crept in. Metal edges not natural, a tube with holes spaced like fasteners, a hatch ring with bolts. This wasn't geology, it was a grave. Halibut tightened the grid. The pilot eased the camera lower until the strobes lit, a field of torn plating fused to the seafloor by force. There was a line of debris stretching away, light objects blown by currents, heavier pieces planted. Follow the tail and you'd reach the comet. The tail led to a shadow that wasn't a shadow. The camera swung and caught a wall, curved, with a familiar radius, and a scar running along it like a seam ripped open. Here's where everything changed. The next pass found geometry no rock could fake. A sail's base, squared-off edges, a mast stump. A Golf II had a distinctive profile, and pieces of it lay here 3 miles down, spread like a puzzle. The team mapped it, frame by frame, tying each photo to the ship's course and timing. In the stitched mosaic, a broken hull lay on its side, the bow angled down, compartments ruptured, the keel twisted. Depth gauge, roughly 16,000 to 16,500 feet, about 4,900 to 5,000 meters. Temperature, near freezing. Pressure, crushing. They didn't cheer, they marked positions. Coordinates became notches in the margin. The point of impact, the start of the debris line, the largest intact section. Every annotation had a second meaning, how a capture device might seat, where the steel looked least ravaged, where a grip wouldn't tear through like tinfoil. The mission was already slipping from reconnaissance into planning, because once you see it, you start thinking about how to touch it. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the data. The debris told a story about the violence of the last minutes, ripped electrical trunks, fractured bulkheads, a snorkel assembly in pieces. Theories would keep breeding, but the physical evidence matched a fast, catastrophic flood that robbed the crew of power and time. No survivors down here. No trapped tapping. Just the quiet of the abyss and a hull that had lost its shape. Back in Washington, the images moved in sealed pouches. A small circle built a case. The wreck is confirmed, the Soviets are searching elsewhere, and the depth, while unprecedented, isn't a hard no if you abandon what's possible and invent. One objection kept surfacing. How do you recover anything without drawing a crowd? That question would dictate the next act. Halibut made one last sweep to refine the box, then slipped away, her wake erased by the weather. The chart showed a rectangle in the middle of the Pacific with a pencil cross at its heart. Inside that cross was a broken submarine with nuclear weapons and secrets dense enough to bend policy. The ocean had revealed the grave. To reach it, they'd have to build a ship no one had seen before and convince the world it was looking for rocks, not ghosts. The offer they couldn't refuse, selling the impossible inside CIA. The photographs hit the table like evidence in a trial. A torn hull, a debris tail, depth scribbled in the margin, 16,000 plus. The room at Langley was small on purpose. Fewer chairs meant fewer people could say they knew. A CIA program manager laid out the case in sentences that didn't waste breath. The location is confirmed. The Soviets searched the wrong grid. The target holds nuclear weapons and potentially code materials. Opportunity window unknown. Then the sentence that bent the room. We think we can take a piece of it. Every head went to the same problem. The ocean wasn't the only adversary. The Soviet Navy would park a trawler on that spot the minute they sensed a recovery. The solution needed to be self-explaining. A big ship sitting still in the middle of nowhere had to look like it belonged there. Intelligence officers live in cover stories. This one had to carry the weight of a city. Someone said the word mining. Deep-sea nodules were on magazine covers. A billionaire could bankroll a fantasy. Howard Hughes' name floated up because it always did when audacity needed a face. If Hughes wanted to go dig up the bottom of the ocean, the world would nod and ask about profit margins. If he wanted to build a ship the size of a football field with a hole in the middle, well, that's how you get rocks off the seafloor, isn't it? The pitch deck, from a CIA office that never admitted it wrote pitch decks, paired romance with math. Cover, a program to harvest manganese nodules for strategic metals. Plausibility, white papers model nodules, a projected market curve. Engineering, a collector lowered on strings of pipe through a center well, nodules funneled up into a giant hold. Reality, replace nodules with a Soviet submarine. Replace the collector with a capture vehicle the size of a house, a claw built to wrap around fractured steel. Replace the hold with a hidden dry dock sealed off from view. The phrase moon pool made it sound nautical. In the drawings, it looked like a throat swallowing secrets. They walked the chain of command through the hurdles. Dynamic positioning to hold station in swell. A gimbaled platform to isolate the lift from roll and pitch. Heave compensation so the sea couldn't snap a 3-mile string like a whip. A pipe handling system to add 60-foot sections one by one, sending the claw down slowly enough to keep the load steady and fast enough to beat weather. At the bottom, Clementine, a capture device with fingers to conform to a distorted hull. The engineering team would need time and money, and a new tolerance for sleep deprivation. Then they put up the slide that always changes the conversation. What's the price? The estimate made the oxygen thinner, hundreds of millions of dollars, real, not padded, with a risk column that used words like unprecedented. but the value column held items that never go on the open market. Insight into Soviet warhead interfaces, metallurgy samples across hull frames, sonar-emitting devices and their mounts, possible code materials if the right compartment came up, a literal Soviet nuclear weapon if one of the torpedoes rode with it. Even a partial haul could recalibrate assumptions across the Pentagon. Pushback came in two flavors. The first was practicality. If the claw failed, the wreck could shred, and the world would be watching a mystery ship do something it couldn't explain. The second was diplomacy. If the Soviets caught them in the act, they wouldn't shrug. The answers were about timing and optics. Build the cover so thick it could take a hit. Compartment the crew so only those who needed to know could blow it. Manage satellite passes. Control port calls. Create shell corporations and lease agreements that routed through Hughes's orbit, where opacity was a feature. There was a human moment that stuck. A senior officer asked what they'd do if they found bodies. The engineer leading the brief didn't blink. "We treat them with respect," he said. That answer earned a nod that was more than courtesy. The mission might be about hardware, but everyone in the room had seen the photos. This was a grave. The approvals moved like a relay. Technical intelligence signed on because this was the only road to certain answers. Operations signed on because the cover was strong and the talent existed to run it. Legal and liaison drafted language for the day reporters asked pointed questions. We can neither confirm nor deny. It sounded like a dodge because it was, but it protected the fact of the operation without lying about details. The Hughes approach began quietly, behind lawyers and handlers, sheltered by his reputation for grand projects and disappearing acts. Meanwhile, contractors got phone calls that didn't mention the word submarine. Global Marine would design and build the ship, Hughes Glomar Explorer, under the mining banner. Aerospace-grade hydraulic firms would work on a platform that wasn't for space and couldn't be for oil. Steel would be ordered that didn't fit any catalog's category. The plan wasn't a drawing anymore. It was a list of shipments and a workforce on rotating clearances. One last question hung at the edge of the map. What if they succeeded? The answer was a set of contingencies: how to handle radiation, how to quarantine recovered items, how to move sensitive gear off the ship without a parade. The cover was robust enough to let them sail without everyone staring. The engineering, if it held, could do what no one had done. The risk was terminal if they slipped. The offer, in the end, wasn't money or fame. It was a chance to open a sealed room in a rival's house. Inside Langley, that was the offer they couldn't refuse. The perfect cover, Howard Hughes and the ocean mining fantasy. They needed a face that could make the impossible look merely eccentric. Howard Hughes fit like a glove. He'd built planes that shouldn't have flown, funded projects that didn't pencil out, and vanished when scrutiny got too close. If Hughes said he wanted to mine the deep ocean for manganese nodules, the press would gawk, scientists would argue, and everyone would accept one thing: only a ship unlike any other could do it. The pitch to his orbit was simple on the surface and labyrinthine underneath. Global Marine would build a revolutionary vessel, Hughes Glomar Explorer, to harvest polymetallic nodules from abyssal plains. The business case wrote itself: nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper, strategic metals for a space-age economy. A collector would ride a long pipe string down through a moon pool, an internal well in the center of the ship, scoop nodules, and pump them up like slurry to giant bins. The animations showed tidy pellets streaming up a pipe. The real drawings replaced pellets with a broken submarine. Secrecy needed frictionless plausibility. Contracts flowed through shell companies with names that sounded like holding firms. Engineering teams got slices of the elephant. A dynamic positioning system here, a gimbaled platform there, hydraulic heave compensation somewhere else. Nobody saw the tusks and trunk in one view unless they had the clearances. If a foreman asked why the center well had gates big enough to swallow a house, the answer was to create a dry work bay safe from waves while handling mining gear. In truth, those gates would close around a Soviet bow section, hiding it from every eye and lens on the ocean. Hughes's mystique did heavy lifting. He didn't give interviews. He didn't do tour. A project for Mr. Hughes could insist on strange requests and be indulged. Reporters sniffed around and found just enough to print. A 618-foot ship designed for long-duration expeditions, with a novel center well, a derrick for pipe handling, an endurance of roughly 100 days, and a slow, steady speed ideal for mowing the seabed. Investors and rival drillship operators peered at the renderings and nodded. It looked like a mining ship if you didn't know what mining ships looked like. The cover had to do more than deflect curiosity. It had to survive collision with official inquiry. Lawyers inside Langley and outside, working for Hughes's maze of companies, drafted stock phrases for congressional staffers and nosy editors. The line that would become famous got polished early. We can neither confirm nor deny. It wasn't theater. It was a legal stance designed to avoid admitting the existence of a classified program while responding to freedom of information demands. The seed of the Glomar response was planted before the ship ever touched water. While that was happening in drafting rooms, steel met sparks. In Los Angeles and along the coast, fabrication bays turned out parts that read like science fiction. The center well's massive doors, the inner gimbal platform, a floating stage that could isolate the heavy lift system from roll and pitch. The hydraulic cylinders that would push and ease a load measured in millions of pounds, smoothing out heave so the sea couldn't snap the pipe string like a metronome gone mad. The ship grew in sections, then as a whole, a 50,000-plus-ton tool pretending to be a laboratory. There were human moments that kept the cover breathing. A PR man brought a bucket of real nodules to a briefing and thumped them on the table like apples. A naval architect, sworn to secrecy, explained to his teenage son why moon pools were cool without saying why this one had to be gigantic. A procurement officer fielded a call from a curious supplier and said, deadpan, Mr. Hughes prefers over-engineering. Everyone smiled at that. Hughes always preferred over-engineering. Complications were constant. The maritime community watches ships the way neighbors watch each other's lawns. Speculation bloomed in trade journals. Was this a vanity project, a tax play, a testbed for deepwater drilling? Competitors in offshore oil sniffed around and balked at the operating costs. Scientists pitched research they wanted to do aboard: chemistry, biology, geology, useful ballast for the story. The CIA vetted guests like bouncers. Fishing fleets and Soviet AGIs, intelligence trawlers, shadowed odd hulls by reflex. The cover had to read solid from binocular distance and in a bar argument. Meanwhile, the handling narrative had to be perfect. You don't drop anchor in 5,000 meters of water, you hover. So they let slip that the ship would use newly refined dynamic positioning to hold station over mining fields. You don't have cranes that can lift full loads in swell, you compensate. So they touted advanced heave control to protect delicate research equipment. You don't lower people into the abyss, you send tools. So they briefed autonomous collectors and showed safe, rounded shapes. There was one more layer: money. The price tag brushed $800 million, roughly $4.7 billion in today's dollars. That number leaked in whispers and made sense for a visionary billionaire chasing the next frontier. In truth, it underwrote the most elaborate salvage cover in history. On paper, it bought a shot at seafloor metals. In the compartmented ledger, it bought the chance to reach a graveyard that could rewrite files across the Pentagon. By the time Hughes Glomar Explorer slid into the water in 1974, the story had hardened into fact. A mining ship would head to a new claim and try techniques nobody had attempted at scale. Cameras clicked. News anchors used the word pioneering. The crew climbed aboard, some carrying one set of instructions, others another. Somewhere below the PR gloss, in a safe that would cross the Pacific, lay a grid of coordinates and a plan to lower a device through that moon pool, close its fingers around a submarine's broken bones, and bring them into the light without anyone on the horizon seeing a thing. Engineering the impossible, the capture vehicle and moon pool. The math came first, and it was ugly. At 16,000 feet, the pressure crushes at more than 7,000 pounds per square inch. Any joint that flexed wrong would fail. Any steel that behaved brittle would snap. The team sketched Clementine, the capture vehicle, like surgeons planning for a patient with shattered bones. The goal wasn't to clamp a perfect cylinder. It was to cradle a deformed hull without driving knives through it. They broke the problem into layers. On the surface sat a ship pretending to be a mine. Inside her, an inner platform, gimbaled, would float within the hull, isolating the heavy lift machinery from the sea's roll and pitch. Around that platform, 4 towering hydraulic cylinders stood like cathedral columns, each capable of inching millions of pounds up or down with the patience of a glacier. Above all of it, a pipe-handling derrick would add 60-foot joints one by one, sending a steel spine down through the moon pool into cold black water. The moon pool was the magic trick. Picture a giant rectangular throat running through the ship, gated at the bottom with doors that could close against the sea. Lower Clementine through it, open the gates, and you had a path to the abyss. Lift the load, close the gates again, pump the water out, and you'd have a hidden dry dock in the ship's belly. From a mile away, nothing would break the surface. No conning tower rising, no hull broaching. Just a quiet ship doing science while swallowing a secret. Clementine itself looked brutal and careful at once. A gantry frame, massive, with rows of fingers designed to flex and conform, not gouge. Each finger had pads, not points, meant to distribute load over plates that might be thinned by corrosion and trauma. The engineers argued about materials late into nights, high-strength steels that kept their toughness at low temperatures, alloys that wouldn't turn glassy under stress. Maraging steels offered strength, but demanded respect. Ductility mattered more than raw numbers if the load shifted unpredictable ways. Heave was the enemy you couldn't see. Even on a calm day, the Pacific heaves. A 3-mile-long pipe string can't act like a rigid rod. It wants to be a jump rope. So they built heave compensation that breathed with the ocean, hydraulic accumulators and control valves that read sensors and eased the load up and down to cancel the ship's motion. The gimbal took out roll and pitch within limits. The compensation took out the vertical dance. Together, they shaved the chaos down to numbers the steel could tolerate. On paper, the lifting capacity sat around 2,000 tons from the seafloor, within a heavy lift system designed to handle up to roughly 14 million pounds with heave compensation and gimbaled isolation. In practice, you derate for safety and unknowns. They ran scenarios. What if the capture fingers seat unevenly? What if a bulkhead collapses mid-lift? What if the bow peels away from the keel like a zipper? The answer was always the same. Move slow enough to feel the changes before they kill you, but not so slow that the ocean wears you out. The control room would become a metronome of pressure gauges and strain meters, every twitch telling a story about forces moving in metal you couldn't see. Dynamic positioning tied the whole dance to the seabed. No anchors, no leeway. Thrusters around the hull whispered and corrected, holding the ship over a point on the planet with the fidelity of a surveyor. Without that, the pipe string would sweep and torque, turning Clementine into a battering ram. With it, the descent became a straight fall through moving water, a pencil lowering into a throat. Fabrication introduced its own theater. In guarded bays, welders stitched together the gimbal bearings, monstrous rings with tolerances you measure by feel, not ruler. The moon pool doors, each weighing more than some coastal ferries, hinged and slammed like vaults in testing. Technicians bled air out of hydraulic lines the way doctors bleed air out of arteries. Everything got shock absorbers and snubbers, sacrificial muscles designed to absorb mistakes before they cascaded. A burr left on a flange could become a crack under cyclic loading at depth. They treated burrs like enemies. There were rehearsals you'd never see on a brochure. In calm anchorages, the crew practiced adding pipe joints, making the couplings sing at the right torque, checking O-rings like talismans. In rougher water, they let the system move and watched the gimbal work, the platform staying eerily level while the ship rolled around it. The first time they cycled the heave compensation under load, a young engineer flinched at a sound only he heard. It was fine. He still didn't sleep that night. One design argument lasted weeks. Where to place crush blocks, sacrificial pads designed to deform first if the load spiked. Put them wrong and they'd mask a failure until too late. Put them right and they'd give operators time to back off before fingers ripped through hull plating like paper. The compromise was a map of weak links and feedback. If this strain gauge spikes, pause. If that microphone hears a frequency above a threshold, stop. If the load drifts more than a set percent, reverse a few feet and breathe. Radiation protocols layered on top. If Clementine brought up nuclear torpedoes or contamination, the moon pool had to be more than stealth. It had to be a quarantine. They planned for sealed containers, filters, dosimeters for everyone in that belly, scrubbers in the air systems, and a disposal plan nobody would discuss over coffee. The mining cover let them run drills without raising eyebrows. Hazmat suits look ordinary when you say chemistry. Meanwhile, across the table from engineers, the operations team built a choreography for silence. Satellite pass predictions, Soviet ship patterns, weather windows, a list of phrases that sounded like mining but meant lift, capture, stop. Compartmentation stayed brutal. Pipe handlers didn't need to know what Clementine would touch. Clementine's team didn't need to know which compartment might hold codes. Everyone needed to know the feel of a load going wrong before it announced itself with a sound no one forgets. When Hughes Glomar Explorer finally sat loaded and ready, the drawings had turned into metal, the what-ifs into procedures, and the moon pool into a promise. Whatever they took, the ocean would not see it, and neither would Soviet eyes on the horizon. They'd lower a hand into 3 miles of dark, close it around a broken thing, and try to lift the past into a room no wave could reach. Sailing into Scrutiny, the voyage and Soviet eyes. They sailed like they belonged there. Hughes Glomar Explorer left Long Beach with the swagger of a research ship on a long assignment, decks stacked with pipe, cranes spotless, a derrick that caught the sun. The manifest read like geology. The briefings used the word manganese enough to numb. But below the PR, the crew lived 2 timelines, the mining story and the recovery plan that only a fraction could recite in full. The ocean didn't care about covers. The North Pacific set its own terms, swell that built in long, indifferent lines, winds that rolled in without ceremony, and a calendar that punished hesitation. The route out threaded fuel stops and PR moments just convincing enough to seed the myth. A handful of science advisors came aboard to talk nodules and sediment cores. Reporters got controlled peeks, nothing that revealed the heart of the ship. The moon pool gates, the gimbal humming like a secret, the way the deck crew handled pipe sections as if each one could break a mission. Station-keeping drills started before anyone admitted that's what they were. Thrusters whispered into alignment. The dynamic positioning console read out coordinates that barely shifted, tenths of a yard over hours. The vessel hovering over a point of ocean the way a helicopter hovers over a road. On deck, pipe handlers got fast, then precise, then quiet. 60-foot joints rose, swung, and stabbed onto couplings with a choreography that looked like muscle memory, because that's what it needed to become. Meanwhile, eyes gathered on the horizon. Soviet AGIs, those fishing trawlers bristling with antennas, had their own schedules and habits. One appeared and lingered at binocular range, slow and patient, logging positions and routines. The cover had to hold here most of all. From a mile out, Glomar Explorer read as advertised. A ship practicing deep-sea mining techniques, pausing, drifting, then holding steady over claims. The brightwork gleamed. The decks showed science, not salvage. The men moved with the rhythm of a research crew. Inside, the compartments tightened. Teams got told only what they needed to know, and sometimes less. A rigger tasked with torquing couplings didn't need to know what waited at 3 miles down. A controls tech monitoring strain gauges knew only the numbers and the thresholds. The Clementine crew had their own sealed routines, checklists in neutral language, hand signals rehearsed in a hangar until they felt like instinct. Radios carried code words that sounded like maintenance. Everyone practiced stopping, backing off, and pausing without drama. Satellite passes became a kind of weather. A small team in a quiet room called out windows when space-based eyes would sweep the site. Those minutes got used for things that looked normal from above. Slow steaming, housekeeping, crew on rails with paint pots, a crate moved, a hose deployed. The real work happened in the gaps. Heave compensation cycled through test profiles. The gimbal took artificial loads and shrugged. The moon pool doors opened a foot, shut, opened a foot again, as if they were being lubricated for mining gear that didn't exist. There was a day the Soviet trawler edged closer. It sat bow on, engines barely engaged, a line of crew along the rail. On Glomar, the bridge logged the contact, and the deck went deliberately boring. Sample boxes, a crane survey, a safety drill with orange vests and shouted counts. The AGI took photos and waited for the show that never came. By nightfall, fog draped the horizon, and the trawler's lights faded like a campsite beyond a ridge. Unknown to those men on the other ship, their own headquarters had been warned months earlier that Americans might try something exotic with the lost submarine. The warning never hardened into belief. The depth sounded like a fairy tale. That skepticism was a shield Glomar Explorer leaned on. The best cover, sometimes, is the limits of another person's imagination. Weather snapped them back to physics. A low rolled through with a barometer drop you could feel in your sinuses. The sea climbed. Heave grew teeth. They stood down the delicate operations and let the ship be a ship, bows rising, stacks of pipe lashed and tested, hands on rails with that alert, waiting posture that mariners wear when water decides to teach. When the front passed, the sea laid down in long breathing swells, and the windows reopened. The night before they committed, a micro-story nobody wrote down made the rounds. A junior watch officer, son of a welder, ran a hand along the moon pool gate and felt the cold come through the metal like a living thing. He didn't pray. He checked the dogged latches twice and walked the perimeter once more. Then he climbed to the control room and took his seat, a headset settling into grooves it had already learned. Morning came without spectacle. Thrusters eased them to the exact cross on the chart. The DP display steadied. Wind over deck barely ruffled the flags. The Soviet horizon was empty for now. On a quiet command the pipe crew stood to, the first joint lifted into air, and the ship started lowering its long arm into the Pacific, not to mine, but to find the dead. Into the abyss, lowering Clementine 3 miles down. The first joint slid into the moon pool with a hollow thud you felt in your ribs. On the control screens, numbers woke up: depth, tension, heave, compensation, stroke, each one a heartbeat of steel. The derrick crew guided the joint to the spinner, locked it, and the wrench sang. 60 feet gone. Add another. Repeat. The rhythm would define the day. Heave compensation came alive like an animal breathing. The sea lifted, gauges dipped. The sea fell, gauges rose. The accumulators drank and exhaled hydraulic fluid to keep the load steady, converting waves into math. The gimbaled platform stayed level, even as coffee cups on outer decks traced tiny circles. In this world, 1/10 of a degree mattered. 1/10 could turn a smooth descent into a whip crack. At 200 joints, more than 12,000 feet of pipe, the string was a cathedral of steel reaching down through cold water that wanted to make it dance. The controls operator kept a thumb near the pores, eyes flicking between strain gauges and a spectral display that translated vibration into color. Too much color at the wrong frequency meant danger, resonance building in a system that spanned 3 miles. He nudged the descent rate, shaving a foot per minute to stay out of the trap. Very little was said on the radios. Hand signals ruled the moon pool deck, palm down to slow, 2 fingers to add torque, a flat blade across the throat to stop. The Clementine team stood inside their fenced-in world, harnessed, eyes on a panel of dials that only made sense if you'd lived with them. They tracked temperature spikes in hydraulic lines, listened through contact mics for the change in pitch that meant a bearing didn't like its job. If a number twitched, a finger hovered, then settled. The ocean got colder, then colder again. At 1,000 fathoms, the water pressed the pipe with an indifference that verged on contempt. The joints squeaked as they seated. The torque chart filled with neat rows, each coupling marked in grease pencil, a small ritual against the scale of what they were doing. The deck boss, an old hand from offshore oil, kept count in his head, and under his breath, a rhythm he'd used for decades now transposed to a mission nobody would believe at a bar. 2/3 down, the descent slowed to a crawl. The cameras on the capture frame went live, a dim cone of light nibbling at particulate that moved like snow in no wind. You couldn't see far. You could see enough. The operators trimmed Clementine's attitude with tiny bursts from its stabilizers so the fingers faced the right way when the bottom rose. Nobody liked to say contact. They preferred approach. The first shadow came too early to be the hull, just a boulder, the light flattening it into false geometry until the camera slid closer and it became a rock again. The second shadow had edges. Bits of metal flashed like fish scales. The pilot breathed out and in, moved a joystick 2 millimeters, and the frame drifted over a field of torn plates embedded in silt. The debris tail. Follow it and you'd find the wreck. Stakes focused into a single demand: don't touch hard. Clementine's fingers hovered open, pads slicked with the sea. The pilot crept down the debris line, pausing when suspended wires loomed, lifting to avoid snagging, sinking again. The hull appeared as a wall, scarred and bent, a curve that had lost its math. The fingers opened wider. You could hear the ship through the mic's now tiny ticks, water moving over metal, a low groan like distant thunder when the current shifted. Contact came as a whisper on the gauges before it came to the eye. A fraction of load appeared, pounds, not tons, just the fingers brushing paint that had become a skin. The pilot paused, let the frame settle, then drew the fingers in until pads met steel, not clamping, holding. The load crept up again, inches of water weight displaced by an embrace. The lead operator called a number, steady, another number, then said, quiet, seat the aft bank. They worked the grips in sequence, watching for uneven strain that would telegraph a weak plate. One pad found air where a bulkhead had torn away. They backed it off and moved to a stronger rib. Another found rust and slid. They teased pressure in until the rust powdered and the pad stopped. Each adjustment sent ripples up the pipe string that the heave system swallowed and calmed. When the last finger took its share, the load readout ticked past a threshold they'd taped on the console. The words they'd rehearsed for this moment were bland to the point of superstition. Initial capture achieved. No cheering. No one leaned on a rail. They checked crush blocks for early signs of martyrdom. None yet. They checked the spectral display for a new color. None. The DP held them on station so cleanly that the position delta might as well have been a rounding error. Stakes were simple. One wrong surge, and 6 years of planning would end in a cloud of silt. Then the ocean reminded them it was there. A slow swell they couldn't feel at the surface added a beat to the load. The compensation system caught most of it and let the rest through as a pulse, harmless if you respected it. The lift lead called for a 3-foot reverse to test the seat. The frame rose, the gauges twitched, the numbers settled. He called for a return to load and a pause. Nothing squealed, nothing banged. They were holding a broken submarine at 16,000 feet. The order to lift didn't sound like history. It sounded like work. Come up at 6 feet per minute. The hydraulic cylinders woke with a smooth hiss. The pipe string remembered it was a column, and metal that had slept in darkness since 1968 began to rise. An inch, then another, then a foot, 3 miles of ocean above, and a ship pretending to mine nodules feeling the first ghost in its hands. The break, when the hull tears free. For the first 100 feet, the numbers behaved. Tension rose in clean increments, the compensation breathed, and the spectral display stayed calm. No angry bands, no hint of resonance. Voices on the net were clipped and even, 6 feet per minute. Hold, check crush indicators. A small pause at each 100-foot mark to let steel find its new story. The load chart showed a gentle slope, heavy but within the plan. Then the slope changed. Not a jump, more like a weight shifting in a sleeper's bed. The strain on one quadrant crept higher while its opposite sagged half a point. The lift lead saw it and called for a stop. The cylinders eased to stillness. Down below, Clementine's fingers held a hull that wasn't a hull anymore. It was a collection of plates and ribs that remembered being whole. The pilot eased pressure on the high quadrant, trimmed another up by a whisper. The numbers settled, but not all the way. Something inside, the wreck, had moved. They resumed at 4 feet per minute. The column flexed invisibly. The compensation took it and smoothed the pulse. Up on the moon pool deck, the pipe couplings came past in their slow parade, each one a tiny victory. In the control room, someone took a breath and forgot to let it out. At 1,000 feet above bottom, the DP ticked half a yard east. The thrusters corrected. The sea, indifferent, sent a set of long-period swells through the world. The first sound came as a vibration, not a noise. Fingers on a tuning fork felt in the palms before it reached the ears. The spectral display flashed a thin line where there shouldn't be one. The lift lead called stop again, a beat of silence. Then, through the contact mics, a groan rolled up the pipe, low and ancient, followed by a dry shriek nobody liked. The pilot feathered pressure off the forwardmost bank. The number dropped. For 10 seconds, the system hung in a balance that felt like standing on brittle ice. Resume at 2 feet per minute. No one argued. The goal shifted from triumph to survival, bring up what would come without provoking the rest. The old oil hand on deck muttered his count softer now, as if loud syllables might travel down the steel. Up 3 feet. Gauges green. Up 3 more. The high quadrant ticked up again. The lift lead preempted the stop. Trim 1.2 aft, 0.8 starboard. The fingers adjusted, pad sighing against metal a human being hadn't touched in 6 years. The numbers obeyed, for a while. Micro-story happened in the corner. A junior controls tech, tracking a secondary strain gauge most people ignored, saw a slow climb that didn't match any other trend. He tapped the glass with a knuckle, then shook his head and raised a hand. Gauge 3-8, he said, not loud, not panicked. The lead stepped over, eyes flicking the panel, and saw it. Fatigue somewhere in the frame, telegraphed through a sensor that sat on a member they'd expected to be asleep. He called a cold pause. The cylinders froze. The compensation hummed, but moved nothing. They held there, a loaded bow section suspended in an ocean's throat. The next noise wasn't a noise. It was a change in the silence, a thickness in the air you felt in your teeth. Then it came, metal screaming in a register that turned spine to glass. The whole pipe string shivered. Someone said, "Loads uneven, hold," the same words from the cold open like an echo. The spectral display bloomed with angry color. The lift lead slapped stop, then reversed 2 feet. The cylinders tried to give. The load didn't want to give back. Clementine's fingers did what they were built to do: grip, distribute, spare the weak. But the wreck wasn't cooperating. Inside that torn cylinder, a bulkhead let go, a seam unzipped, or a keel rib decided it had given all it could. The high quadrant spiked. Crushed blocks in one bank deformed with a dull, sacrificial thud, buying time measured in heartbeats. The operator felt the frame lurch as if a floor had shifted under his chair. He said, "We're losing it," so softly the mic barely caught it. The lift lead made the only call left. Reverse 3, trim off the high, relieve pressure on the forward banks. The system moved like a tired animal, slow, determined. The numbers came down, then surged, then down. The groan in the mics became a tearing nobody mistook for anything else. Through the cameras, all you saw was darkness and snow. Through the ship's bones, you felt the moment history slips. And then it happened. A violent shudder ran the length of the column. The control room felt it in their seats before the gauges could spell it out. The load on 2 quadrants collapsed as if a floor emptied under them. The opposite 2 took a brief, suicidal surge, then dropped. The screen cut off. In the moon pool, the pipe jumped, a quiet, murderous twitch. On deck, hands flinched and froze. In a breath, tons of steel tore free below and began to fall. Silence, the kind that eats words. The compensation smoothed an echo. The DP held them steady as if nothing had happened. The gauge that mattered most read a new, smaller number, still heavy but missing a piece. The lead said, "Hold, hold," and nobody moved a finger. Time elongated. You don't chase a falling wreck. You don't jerk on a wound. They waited 3 long minutes, watching for aftershocks in metal and sea. The mics went quiet except for the sound of water doing what water always does. Someone on the deck exhaled the breath he'd been holding for 1.5 minutes and looked at his hands, because they were shaking. When they eased the frame up those first cautious feet, the load remained steady. Whatever had gone had gone. What stayed, stayed. The cameras, when they dared aim, saw what the numbers already told them. Padding pressed against contorted plating, a geometry that matched the forward shape they'd modeled, the bow, or enough of it to claim the word. The after-structure that had shared the lift a moment before was gone, curtains of silt still drifting where it had been. The human moment came quiet, no shouting, no swearing. The lift lead, eyes rimmed red, said, "We keep what we have." The old oil hand nodded and picked up his count again. The junior tech stared at his small gauge because it had been right before anyone else. The pilot loosened his jaw and tightened his hand. The ship, pretending to mine, began the longest, slowest recovery of a broken front end through 3 miles of water, carrying with it, unknown yet, 2 nuclear torpedoes, the bodies of 6 men, and proof that even a perfect plan can't rewrite what 3 miles of ocean pressure did to steel. What they brought up: secrets, remains, and silence. They nursed the load toward daylight like carrying a sleeping child through a crowded room. No sudden movements, no heroics. The numbers drifted in narrow lanes, and the mantra held: keep what we have. When the pipe crown finally rose high enough, and the order came to close the moon pool doors, the ship changed character. The ocean disappeared beneath steel gates, pumps thumped, and water dropped away from the frame. Outside, to binoculars on any horizon, nothing happened. Inside, a Soviet submarine's forward section entered a room built to pretend it wasn't there. The air in the bay turned sharp and chemical, filters working, alarms armed, dosimeters clipped on like ID badges. The crew moved in small teams, faces behind shields, steps measured, voices low. Clementine settled into docking legs. The pads eased off, a fraction at a time, freeing metal that had been held with a careful, reluctant grip. The first sight wasn't romantic. Twisted plating, torn cabling, edges rubbed smooth by silt. A bellied curve that once had purpose and now was just shape. And in the angles and shadows, the reality that this wasn't scrap, it was evidence. They worked the finds methodically. A torpedo cradle, bent but identifiable, its warhead nuclear still mounted. A second, buried in the snarl, the markings muted under ocean skin. 2 nuclear torpedoes secured. These weren't trophies, they were hazards and answers. The weapons teams followed the playbook: isolate, secure, double-check radiation with instruments that didn't care about nerves. Numbers stayed where they should. Relief lived in data, not in size. Panels came off in a choreography of bolts, pry, lift, pass. Sonar transducers, warped but legible, told stories about Soviet ears, frequencies, mountings, dampers. Sections of hull and frames went to tagged racks, samples that metallurgists would later cut, polish, and read like rings in a tree, learning how Soviet steel behaved where it cracked, how welds failed at the grain. A cluster of electronics, burnt, corroded, still yielded board layouts, connector types, the logic of a system even when the system was dead. You could feel the analysts writing reports in their heads as they worked. The question of codes hovered like a weather front. Compartments that might have held cryptographic materials weren't in what they'd saved, or if they were, time and pressure had made their own edits. The team didn't guess. They bagged, logged, and let classification do its future work. The plan had always carried a line between hope and hype. On the deck plates, reality drew it clean. Then the room shifted, not the ship people. A hand paused on a beam that wasn't a beam. A helmeted head leaned in and didn't speak. 6, that was the count when they were done. Human remains, intact enough to be undeniable, fragile in ways that made everyone clumsy with care. Words got simpler. Ma'am and sir turned into yes and okay. The gear stayed the same: gloves, suits, masks, but the purpose altered. They weren't salvaging now, they were tending. The decision, in truth, had been made before they sailed. If they found them, they would return them to the sea with honors. In the Moon Pool Bay, that policy became a ceremony: washing, wrapping. A flag where a flag mattered, even if the stars weren't theirs. A chaplain's words without a chapel. The ship came to a kind of attention. Cameras recorded, not for broadcast, not for leverage, but because history sometimes needs witnesses with proof. Later, in 1992, that film would cross an ocean and land in Moscow as a gesture that said the quiet thing: we knew, and we cared enough to do this right. Other items brought a different kind of weight. The ship's bell emerged from a tangle, mute and stubborn, a circle of metal that had marked time and calls to stations in another language. It went into a crate with a label that didn't say the word trophy. Engineers eased instrument panels free that would be teased for insights about Soviet design philosophy, what they ruggedized, what they compromised, where they cut corners, where they didn't. A sonar head, once an ear, would become a specimen. Outside the gates, the ocean kept its face blank. The Soviet trawler that had loitered earlier traced lazy arcs on the horizon, found nothing to report, and steamed off, bored. Glomar Explorer's decks played the part. Guys with clipboards, hoses rinsing nothing in particular, a crane test that looked like maintenance. Inside, a cold room filled with tagged metal, and a secure locker took in things that wouldn't see light again without a classification stamp. When the bay was as empty as it could be, when the checklists were down to signatures, and the radiation monitors had chirped their last for the day, the mood didn't swing. It sunk a notch into something like exhaustion dressed as professionalism. They hadn't won in the way the pitch had promised. They hadn't failed in the way the scream had threatened. They had pulled a piece of an enemy's secret world into theirs and treated the dead like sailors. The ship didn't linger, where the windows and satellite tracks still ruled. The route out was the route home, with one more layer of quiet laid on top, crates locked, faces unreadable, a cover story still intact enough to stand if pressed. And in the holds and vaults, a harvest that didn't glitter but mattered, 2 nuclear torpedoes secured, structural truths written in steel, sonar and engineering clues, and a film can that would become a bridge no one expected to build. Cover intact, press leaks, and the Glomar response. On paper, the mission ended when the moon pool doors shut and the ship turned for home. In reality, the hardest phase was just beginning. Keep the world from stitching together what had happened in the middle of nowhere. The cover story still wore its grin, mining, research, nodules. But secrets have a way of vibrating through systems. Contractors talk to spouses. Dockworkers notice crates with escorts. A reporter hears a phrase that doesn't belong and pulls the thread. The first hints came as gossip in maritime trade rags. Hughes had funded something strange. The mining ship stayed over one patch of ocean for weeks without bringing up anything that looked like ore. Then the whispers got teeth. A burglary at a Hughes subsidiary in Lowe's, Angels produced rumors of stolen documents that mentioned a project no one would confirm. Names floated: Global Marine, Summer. A few lines suggested the word recovery without saying what. Inside Langley, phones stayed cool by training. The guidance had been rehearsed. Speak from the cover, not around it. Refer to public filings. Mention manganese. If a question comes too close, route it to counsel. Meanwhile, inside the CIA's legal shops and at Justice, lawyers drafted responses to what they knew would arrive next. FOIA requests from reporters who smelled something larger than nodules. The line had already been tested in internal memos. It would soon get a public debut. Press interest crested in early 1975, after the at-sea recovery attempt of 1974. The Lowe's Angels Times and others assembled fragments from sources who couldn't stop talking entirely. The story they printed was careful and explosive in the same breath. A CIA operation to recover a sunken Soviet submarine using a ship built under the cover of deep-sea mining, financed through Howard Hughes. No details about where or what came up. Enough context to turn heads in every capital that mattered. Reporters called for confirmation. The CIA had an answer ready that sounded like a riddle and functioned like armor. We can neither confirm nor deny. The phrasing wasn't poetry. It was policy, hammered into shape to survive court challenges and congressional scrutiny. Confirming or denying the existence of a program can itself reveal classified facts. The Glomar response drew a line, hard, simple, repeatable. It didn't satisfy anyone. It protected everything. In newsrooms, editors argued about how far to push. The Hughes angle was irresistible. The recluse billionaire, the massive ship, the science gloss. The Cold War angle was sober. What if this compromised ongoing operations or diplomacy? Some outlets published sketches and satellite photos of the vessel, deck plans that looked like speculation, arrows pointing to the moon pool labeled with a question mark. Others ran op-eds about secrecy and the public's right to know what vast sums were buying. Unknown to readers, Moscow parsed the same coverage with a different hunger. Soviet officers who'd shrugged at earlier warnings now stared at clippings and asked themselves whether the Americans truly could reach that deep. The answer, partial and infuriating, was yes. But proof mattered, and proof was scarce. There'd been a ship. There might have been an attempt. There were no images of a submarine rising from the Pacific. Skeptics inside their system clung to that absence. Realists began to plan as if a second try could come. The legal battles shaped a new terrain. Journalists and advocacy groups filed FOIA suits demanding documents about the mining ship and any ties to the CIA. In court, the agency repeated the line and added the logic behind it. Judges, in opinions that would be cited for decades, acknowledged that acknowledging can be a disclosure. The Glomar response became case law, a phrase that would outlive the vessel whose name it carried. On the pier, human stories kept crossing the narrative. A deckhand's wife asked why his science cruise carried so many guards. A machinist in a bar said you'd never believe the bearings he'd worked on, then shut his mouth when someone at the next table leaned in. A junior congressman read a classified briefing that answered his questions and gave him 5 new ones he couldn't ask in public. The country learned a new habit, accepting that sometimes an agency would refuse to answer even the most basic question: is there a project? Back at Langley, planners weighed the idea of going back. An Azorian II had a logic. What fell could still be taken. Engineers had sketched changes to Clementine's fingers, materials with more give, a lift profile even slower, load monitoring more granular. But secrecy was a consumable good, and theirs had been burned in the headlines. The Soviet Navy's curiosity had sharpened. Soviet trawlers would haunt the coordinates like gulls at a dump. Satellites would write a tighter schedule. $800 million already spent hung over every discussion like weather. The decision slid from speculation to conclusion: cancel. Not because they couldn't, but because too many eyes were now fixed on the spot. Risk wasn't just technical anymore. It was geopolitical, legal, reputational. The partial victory had to stand. The cover would be nursed back to life where possible. Press events about ocean resources, papers about mining that led nowhere. But the beating heart of the operation would not be restarted. In the aftermath, the phrase that saved the mission's bones kept echoing in places far beyond the ocean. We can neither confirm nor deny. It would be used in cases that had nothing to do with submarines, in queries about satellites, drone strikes, budgets. A sentence born of a ship with a hole in its middle became a doctrine. And the Glomar Explorer, photographed and argued over, sailed into a quieter chapter, its greatest performance hidden behind a line that told the world just enough to stop asking. The aborted Encore, planning Azorian II. Back at Langley, the mood was a mix of pride and unfinished business. What slipped back into the dark might still be reachable. Engineers didn't mourn, they redrafted. On whiteboards, Clementine grew softer in all the right places. More ductile pads, longer fingers with wider load paths, crush blocks mapped like fuses, strain gauges doubled and tripled so a whisper in steel would be heard earlier. The lift profile flattened. 6 feet per minute became 4, then 2, with programmed holds like yoga breaths to let metal relax. The case for a second attempt wrote itself if you stared only at the wreck. The aft sections could hold the compartments everyone had argued about: crypto spaces, missile interface hardware, navigation logs fused into cabinets that might still give up something. The first lift had proven the path to the bottom: the heave system, the gimbal, the moon pool quarantine. The failure had been in the marriage between old steel and new grip. Change the marriage. But the ocean wasn't the only variable anymore. The press had found the scent. Glomar had become a proper noun with a question mark stuck to it. Soviet attention, once dulled by disbelief, sharpened into habit. AGIs loitered more, patrol schedules flexed. In meetings that began with performance charts, the conversation always bent to eyes. How many, how close, how patient. A second try would be a performance in a crowded theater. Budget sat in the corner like a judge. 800 million had already been sunk into a myth and a moment. To go back meant more money and more visibility through procurement trails that reporters now watched. Congressional briefings had turned frostier. Staffers, who once nodded through euphemism, asked sharper questions in closed sessions and carried concerns back to bosses eager to look prudent on Sunday shows. The mining cover, still serviceable, couldn't carry another season without sagging. Operationally, the Soviets now assumed the Americans could reach that depth. That changed the chessboard. Fishing fleets with extra eyes, satellites with tighter tasking, naval units briefed to sniff for odd station keeping. Every layer constricted the window. The satellite pass charts, once generous, shrank into slivers where both cloud cover and orbital geometry cooperated. Weather couldn't be ordered to match. There was a human current too. The crew who'd felt the wrench in the column understood the margin for error wasn't measured only in engineering tolerances. It was measured in luck and time. A second lift meant living again with the sound that had cut the room in half. The engineers trusted their revisions. The operators trusted their hands. Everyone understood the ocean's veto still stood. In a conference room with no windows, the decision arrived without ceremony. The program manager walked through the risks in plain English: elevated Soviet presence at the site, compromised cover, rising political heat, uncertain yield from remaining sections, additional cost. The conclusion wasn't a retreat dressed up as prudence. It was a choice to keep what had been bought with so much secrecy intact. Cancel Azorian, aye. The aftermath felt like a factory powering down. Drafts slid into drawers. Material orders stalled and then evaporated. Contractors pivoted to other projects and didn't say the word submarine over lunch again. On the ship, tools went back into crates with tags that didn't hint at what they'd touched. The gimbal kept its quiet grace beneath a deck that would, soon enough, host different work for different clients under a different budget line. A micro-story slipped out with the tide. An engineer who'd argued for softer pads folded his revised drawing into an envelope and mailed it to himself, a postmark to mark an idea that wouldn't be built. A pipe boss dialed a number he only used once and said, "We're stood down," then hung up and sat with the silence. A lawyer updated a memo with a phrase that would outlast all of it: neither confirm nor deny. The wreck stayed where it was, a half-solved puzzle on the floor of the Pacific. The Americans had touched it once and learned things that mattered. The rest would belong to speculation, to declassified footnotes released in cautious drips, to rumors swapped in bars near bases. Azorian didn't end with a second crane shot. It ended with restraint, an admission that sometimes, after you bend reality, the wisest move is to stop pulling. Echoes in deep water, what Azorian changed. The ship steamed away, but the wake ran for decades. Start with the metal. Offshore engineers cribbed from Glomar Explorer like students swapping notes. Dynamic positioning, once a curiosity, became the standard for deepwater drilling, cable laying, and subsea construction. Thrusters whispering against current, a ship locked to a GPS cross as if anchored to an invisible spike. The oil patch copied it, improved it, built fleets around it. Azorian proved you could hold still above an abyss long enough to do surgery. Then the way you fight the sea. Heave compensation moved from papers to practice, hydraulic lungs breathing against swell, turning motion into math. Crane makers borrowed the logic for ship-to-ship lifts. Salvage firms scaled it down for ROV tethers that wouldn't saw themselves to death. The gimbaled platform, a cathedral floor floating inside a ship, showed up in patents and prototypes. Nobody said submarine in the footnotes. They didn't have to. The lineage was obvious. The moon pool changed ship design language. Before Azorian, a center well was a quirk. After, it became a tool on research vessels, drill ships, heavy lift barges, because it let you work in the calm heart of the hull, away from the tantrums at the rail. The Glomar Explorer's gated center well and hidden dry dock concept became a template. Gates got smarter. Seals got better. Dry habitat operations, quarantine bays, even covert retrievals of satellites and aircraft parts leaned on the same trick. Do the delicate work where waves can't pry. The policy echo lived in one sentence. We can neither confirm nor deny, escaped the legal memo and became case law, then culture, the Glomar response. FOIA officers leaned on it. Judges weighed it. Reporters learned its edges and pushed them. It didn't end arguments, it defined them. A phrase born to protect a single ship's secret turned into a doctrine for space programs, drone operations, black budgets, a guardrail between public right to know and methods that vanish if named. Intelligence learned something subtler, how to scale a cover to the size of an industry. The Hughes story wasn't a fake press release. It was an ecosystem, white papers, models, conferences, patents, a ship you could touch, a mission you could half believe. Future programs took the lesson. Build covers that work even if you bump into them. Compartment ruthlessly. Give every worker a truth that explains their piece. Let the lie be swallowed by plausible ambition. There was a moral thread too. The burial at sea, 6 men, a flag, a filmed ceremony that crossed a Cold War boundary, left a mark. In quiet channels, navies compared notes about handling the dead. There are red lines even rivals don't cross. Years later, when debris from other tragedies surfaced, that restraint echoed. Respect the grave, honor the uniform, keep trophies out of the story. Geopolitically, Azorian forced an adjustment in Moscow and Washington. The depth barrier lost mystique. If the Americans could reach 3 miles down once, planners assumed they could reach again, or that someone soon would. That nudged norms into place, not treaties, but understandings about salvaging each other's losses. It also fueled a private race in undersea sensing, stealth, and counter-recovery. Submarines got quieter. Seabeds got busier with ears. Commercial spin-offs hid in plain sight. Deep-sea mining, once a speculative headline, found real money decades later. Companies showed renderings of collectors riding pipe strings through moon pools. Engineers who'd studied Glomar's patents nodded at the shapes. Not everything traced back to Azorian, but the DNA was there. Dynamic positioning, heave systems, centerwell operations, long-duration endurance. A covert salvage ship had sketched a blueprint for a frontier industry. Inside the intelligence world, Azorian became a case study in risk. Audacity isn't a virtue by itself. It needs timing, cover, and an exit. The partial success, forward section up, aft lost, taught managers to calibrate appetite, define what enough looks like before you start. The cancelled sequel taught something harder. Know when to stop even if the prize sparkles. That restraint is rarer than courage. It also keeps programs alive. There's another echo most people miss: failure data. Engineers learn more from breaks than from wins. Managing steel's behavior under cold stress, finger geometry against fractured plates, load monitoring thresholds. Those details traveled into design rooms and quietly altered what ships, cranes, ROV frames, and capture tools look like. Somewhere in a modern heavy lift spec is a line that exists because Clementine screamed once and held once. Lessons later echoed in offshore lifting, DP drillships, and salvage playbooks. Public memory, of course, prefers the headline. The CIA tried to steal a Soviet sub. But the lasting impact hides in how we do hard things at sea and how institutions talk about secrets. A ship with a hole in her middle proved that the abyss can be worked like a workshop if you respect physics and plan for silence. A legal phrase proved that sometimes the honest answer to a fair question is a boundary, not a briefing. And the wreck, most of it stayed where it fell, a cold museum on a plane without visitors. That absence matters too. It keeps a question open enough to pull new eyes to the story every decade, to test new theories against old steel, to remind people that the ocean still holds more than it gives. Azorian didn't close a chapter. It taught how to write in water and how the ripples outlive the splash. The human ledger, families, memory, and a secret funeral. News in the Soviet Union didn't arrive. It failed to. Wives learned to measure hope by the emptiness of a mailbox. A mother boiled tea twice a day in case a son walked in on leave by surprise, then poured it out cold. Official notices were sparse, formulaic, and late. K-129 wasn't lost in headlines. It was erased in whispers. In closed apartments, people spoke around the word submarine the way you avoid saying a name at a wake before the body is found. Meanwhile, on a ship that couldn't admit what it carried, 6 men were prepared for burial with a care that made the room change temperature. You can hear formality in the way tools are set down. Wrappings were measured, not improvised. A chaplain's voice reached for words that fit sailors who'd never heard his language. The flag that covered them was a choice, respect before rivalry. On deck above, the watch kept routine. Below, the Pacific waited with the patience of a graveyard. The ceremony wasn't public, but it wasn't private either. A camera recorded the service start to finish, not as leverage, not as proof against an accusation, but because someone in the chain had decided that one day the act should be seen by the people who'd been denied a funeral. You don't often see policy get tender around the edges. Here it did. The ship slowed, voices lowered. The dead went back to the sea with honors they hadn't been granted on land. Take a micro story. A Glomar crewman with grease still under his nails stood shoulder to shoulder with an officer in dress whites borrowed for the moment. Neither man spoke Russian. Both men bowed their heads the same way when the last words fell quiet. Afterward, the deck returned to its tasks, but the bay stayed changed. Work resumed, softer at the edges, as if loudness could bruise. Across an ocean, the Soviet families received a story designed to comfort and to contain. Lost at sea, heroic duty, no coordinates, no recovery. The state kept grief tidy because public mourning can grow teeth. A widow took the letter and put it in a drawer with wedding photos and a seashell her husband once brought home to make their boy laugh. She told the child that his father served under the waves where whales sing. That was the truth she could carry. Years later, in 1992, a copy of the burial film crossed a bureaucratic threshold and became a parcel for Moscow. It wasn't an apology. Nations don't do those well. It was a bridge. Russian officers watched American sailors give their men the rights they'd been denied by circumstance and secrecy. Some of those officers had served under commanders who dismissed the possibility of recovery as fantasy. The room where they screened the footage stayed silent longer than the tape ran. Memory keeps receipts the official record won't. In village cemeteries, families of K-129 carved dates without remains. At reunions, toasts rose to empty chairs. In naval academies, instructors taught systems and tactics, and when they reached the 1968 patrols, some paused and pushed on. In the Pacific, currents moved over a crushed hull while, in a filing cabinet in Langley, a film canister gathered dust until geopolitics loosened its lid. On the American side, the people who'd stood in that moon pool bay carried their own ledger. Some names never left their mouths because secrecy has its habits. What did stick was the feel of the room when the remains were found, the shift from mission to mourning. Years later, asked what the hardest moment had been, one of them didn't mention the lift or the break. He said, quietly, the service. That line travels because it's human and because it's true. There's a paradox at the heart of Azorian that only the families can resolve. The operation sought secrets. What it found demanded decency. Intelligence programs rarely intersect with funerals. When they do, they leave marks. The men who went to sea in K-129 became, for a few hours in a sealed room inside an American ship, sailors again, not adversaries. That's the human ledger. Names written in water, a ceremony filmed in silence, and the long, patient work of memory outlasting politics. Open questions, theories, disputes, and what we still don't know. Some stories end with a stamp. This one ends with ellipses. Start with the simplest question. Why did K-129 go down? The leading view sits with a chain of failures around the snorkel. Air intake open in bad water. A slug of seawater racing in, flooding engines and battery spaces. Electrical shorts sparking toxic gas. Propulsion dying. The boat dropping past safe depth until the hull let go. It fits physics and the wreck's condition. It doesn't comfort. Other theories refuse to leave the room. A collision, American or Soviet, whispered about by sailors who knew how crowded the Pacific gets below periscope depth. The evidence is thin on paper, persuasive in barlight. Scars that could be impact, timelines that almost overlap. An accidental missile incident, warhead or oxidizer detonating during handling, has fewer supporters. The forward damage reads more like pressure and structural failure than a missile's signature. A battery explosion. Possible, but again, the acoustic and physical picture points to a rapid descent, an implosion sequence. Each theory carries a constituency and a grievance. Even the location feeds arguments. The US mapped the site with SOSUS and AFTAC narrowing the box, and later deep reconnaissance confirmed a debris trail leading to a broken hull. The Soviets searched far to the west. That mismatch nags at pride and narrative. If you're Moscow, it's a failure you don't print. If you're Washington, it's an advantage you don't brag about. The ocean kept the witness list short. What about what came up? We know the forward section rose, roughly 38 feet, and that inside it were 2 nuclear torpedoes, structural samples, sonar hardware, and 6 men who were buried at sea with honors. That aligns with declassified accounts and technical histories. Codebooks and cryptographic gear remain a fog. Some accounts insist fragments appeared. Others say the compartments that mattered weren't in the captured section. The most sober reading is simple. The juiciest crypto lay aft, and aft is what fell. Speculation fills the vacuum because classification does the same job. There's also the fill. The CIA shot the operation, engineering, procedures, the burial. Years later, a portion of that burial footage went to Russia. The rest sits where Vault Air turns reels into artifacts. What would the unreleased frames show? A better view of the capture, clues about the state of the wreck, or just men working in a sealed room doing what the checklist told them to do? The unanswered question breeds conspiracy, but restraint likely overrules drama. Then the money question. Was it worth it? Technologists point to dynamic positioning, heave compensation, moon pool operations, the toolset that grew an industry. Intelligence veterans say the partial haul filled real gaps about Soviet metallurgy, sonar, and weapons. Critics see $800 million and a broken prize. The truth works like most truths in covert projects. Value accrues in quiet, across domains, and almost never in a single headline. One detail keeps its power because it resists spin. The mechanical failure during the lift wasn't an engineering mystery so much as a materials lesson. Marrying steel fingers, pads designed to spread load, crush blocks sacrificing themselves in sequence. All of it right until old Soviet steel decided it had reached the end of its story. That moment still divides rooms. With different fingers, a different pace, a different sea, does the rest come up? Or does the ocean always veto hubris the same way? There are human unknowns too. What did the families hear years later when the burial film was shown in Moscow? Did it help? Did it reopen a wound? On the American side, how many of the men in that bay ever told their children what they'd done? And if they did, how did they phrase it in a language that still won't take the word confirm? What nobody knew at the time is still partly true now. The ocean keeps better secrets than governments. The wreck lies there, visited by cameras we don't see, debated by people who can't show their sources. Every few years, a declassification adds a paragraph and removes a sentence. The story breathes. The ache remains. One ship faked a future to steal a past, and the ocean let it take only what it could hold. If you want more untold operations where engineering and secrecy collide, subscribe now to get the next deep dive first. And watch this next episode on the Navy's quiet race to tap undersea cables. It connects directly to what Azorian set in motion.